Sì, ascoltiamo, va bene per lei?
Sì, sì, certo,
Così ho una, diciamo, maggiore
visione migliore.
ricezione.
Poi
Ok,
un attimo,
buongiorno. Allora
è
tolgo via
avviata
la
anche la sessione
videocamera.
su YouTube, quindi diamo avvio.
Eh, Gaetano, scusa, allora anch'io mi oscuro, come dire, cercherò di ascoltarvi per quanto è possibile questa mattina, il pomeriggio ho lo spoglio, quindi sarà proprio
D'accordo, sì,
impossibile. Poi ci rivediamo
ognuno
domani.
sia libero ed è libero di fare quello che ritiene opportuno.
Grazie.
Nicolò, vedo che sei collegato. Se riesci a interloquire tu con il professor Griffin,
Buongiorno a tutti. Solo che non so perché non riesco in pratica a collegarmi in video. Non so che cosa stia succedendo. Mi sentite?
forse
Buongiorno a tutti, mi sentite?
Buongiorno,
sì,
sì.
sentirti ti sentiamo.
Ok.
Se riesci a parlare tu direttamente con il professor Griffin,
Sì, intanto lo
perché
saluto.
ho
Buongiorno, saluto
cercato di...
tutti. Un attimo solo, cerco di risolvere
Ancora
questo
ci
problema
sono
con...
altre persone in attesa, un attimo che metto tutto.
Non so quello che stia succedendo.
Allora, adesso, indipendentemente da problemi eventuali, penso che sia il caso di avviare il convegno, altrimenti rimandiamo all'infinito. Quindi, appunto, aspettiamo che sì, appunto, come vi dicevo, chi non deve intervenire, per piacere, tolga l'audio, il video, eventualmente, appunto, così la connessione dovrebbe essere più fluida ed evitiamo di, eh, con rumori estranei, di disturbare chi sta parlando. Allora, prima di dare la parola al direttore del conservatorio, Maria Grande, che appunto è collegata. Scusate che ogni tanto devo ammettere chi è in ritardo o chi si scollega per qualche problema e quindi c'è qualche piccolo inconveniente. Quindi appunto mi tocca anche a nome di Nicolò Macchevino che ha organizzato con me questo convegno di dare il benvenuto a tutti, ai vecchi, tra virgolette, ai nuovi che con il loro intervento ci consentono appunto di portare avanti ormai da tanti anni questo tradizionale appuntamento. Ringraziamo ovviamente la direzione perché appunto è il conservatorio di cui facciamo parte che ogni anno autorizza e accetta volentieri questi nostri convegni e dunque appunto ci dà tutto il supporto necessario. Ci dispiace che quest'anno sia appunto online come è stato l'anno scorso e non in presenza, però cerchiamo di trarre profitto dalle opportunità offerte da questo collegamento online che ci consente di raggiungere una platea più vasta di persone che speriamo interessate. Non mi dilungo di più perché poi c'è il tempo per interventi specifici. Do la parola dunque alla professoressa Maria Grande, il direttore del conservatorio, che appunto ringrazierà e senz'altro immagino, ma permettetemi di farlo anche io stesso, anche a nome di Ingolo, sia il professor Toscani, rappresentante della Società Italiana di Museologia, presidente, che appunto ha patrocinato questo intervento, questo convegno, così anche Lucio Tufano come rappresentante della Società Italiana per lo studio del secolo XVIII e anche appunto il dottor Stefani che ha segnalato questo convegno nella rivista Drammaturgia, rivista di cui accettiamo, cogliamo e richiamiamo volentieri il motto con cui appunto si presenta su internet. Do quindi la parola alla professoressa Maria Grande e mi taccio. Grazie, prego Mariella.
Buongiorno a tutti, buongiorno Gaetano, grazie veramente per questa ulteriore opportunità di studio, di approfondimento, di ricerca che naturalmente ogni anno il Conservatorio riesce a portare avanti proprio grazie al vostro lavoro, ecco, e anche alla vostra perseveranza. Io intanto porgo il mio sentito e caloroso benvenuto a tutti gli ospiti che anche quest'anno animeranno il convegno incentrato, come voi sapete meglio di me, sull'ultimo atto nell'opera del Settecento. Ancora una volta devo dire, come già detto dal maestro Piterresi, siamo costretti a incontrarci attraverso uno schermo, però sono veramente grata ai colleghi, a Gaetano e a Nicolò, che nonostante le difficoltà non hanno esitato, così come purtroppo è venuto anche lo scorso anno, a proporre e organizzare questo incontro che per il nostro conservatorio è ormai diciamo un appuntamento attesissimo dai colleghi e cosa molto più importante dagli studenti che sempre in maggior numero chiedono di poter ascoltare le relazioni dei musicologi che interverranno. E di questo devo ringraziare ancora una volta i due colleghi perché grazie proprio alla loro intensa attività di ricerca che ha posto il nostro istituto all'avanguardia in questo ambito, e proprio diciamo a loro si deve il fatto che il nostro istituto abbia chiesto e ottenuto l'accreditamento da parte del Ministero dell'Università e della Ricerca dei corsi accademici di musicologia e quindi sia dei corsi triennali sia dei corsi biennali. Purtroppo, che dire, quest'anno la modalità online non ci permetterà di offrire ai nostri ospiti, anche alla nostra città, i consueti appuntamenti musicali che da sempre hanno impreziosito e rappresentato un piacevole corollario alle relazioni dei nostri studiosi. Ma sono convinta naturalmente che leggendo sulla brochure i nomi illustri che prenderanno parte al convegno, che sarà comunque un appuntamento ricco di contenuti e di alto valore scientifico. Io non voglio rubare tempo alle vostre ricerche, alle vostre relazioni. Cercherò di essere collegata e di seguire anche su YouTube per quanto mi è possibile questo convegno. Vi saluto naturalmente con l'auspicio che il prossimo anno possiamo tutti rivederci per godere, oltre che naturalmente della vostra competenza, anche di quegli incontri conviviali, di commenti, delle risate e poter condividere anche quindi quei momenti di leggerezza che dopo una giornata di lavoro interessante certamente, ma anche faticosa, tutti noi sentiamo la necessità. Quindi nel ringraziarvi ecco, di essere qui con noi e quindi di arricchire chiaramente la nostra attività di ricerca, io vi auguro buon lavoro e spero di rivedervi nel corso delle sedute in modo tale da poter ecco, anche io imparare qualche cosa. Vi ringrazio e vi auguro buon lavoro.
Grazie alla professoressa Grande e do la parola perché purtroppo per impegni già presi la presidente professoressa Cettina Nicolosi non potrà intervenire, però appunto do quindi la parola al professor Claudio Toscani, presidente della Società Italiana di Musicologia, sempre vicino a noi e società che ha patrocinato il convegno di quest'anno e come anche degli anni precedenti. Un attimo che devo appunto passare alla visione per dare appunto la parola al professor Toscani.
Buongiorno a tutti, do il mio caloroso benvenuto a nome della Società Italiana di Musicologia che è felice e onorata di appoggiare ancora una volta questa iniziativa dandole il patrocinio. tanto più che il convegno è arricchito da un prestigioso consesso di relatori e di studiosi, quindi benvenuti a tutti, grazie per la partecipazione, grazie anche a tutti i convenuti. Il convegno che prende avvio in questo momento è dedicato a un tema forse apparentemente marginale nel contesto degli studi musicologici internazionali, ma che in realtà è importantissimo perché ha dei risvolti fondamentali sulla drammaturgia, sulla storia del melodramma, insomma sull'oggetto dei nostri studi. Quindi sicuramente non deluderà le aspettative e terrà fede alle promesse. Mi complemento anche con l'istituzione, col Conservatorio di Reggio Calabria, che assicura la continuità di una tradizione ormai lunghissima che permette a questo conservatorio di assumere un ruolo assolutamente di rilievo, una posizione tra le primissime tra i conservatori nazionali per il sostegno che assicura alla ricerca, a queste iniziative, ma anche alle iniziative culturali molto in generale. E sono tanto più felice di parlare all'inaugurazione di questo convegno in quanto contro tutte le aspettative ha potuto essere realizzato in uno dei periodi più difficili della nostra storia contemporanea, non solo per la presenza della pandemia che ci impedisce di avere contatti diretti, di ritrovarci in presenza, ma anche per tutti gli ostacoli che la situazione, come sappiamo, pone alla ricerca, alla consultazione dei documenti, alla frequentazione di archivi e biblioteche. Quindi è tanto più meritorio il conservatorio e gli amici organizzatori per essere riusciti a continuare e a promuovere iniziative di questo tipo, che sono anche un forte segnale di ottimismo, credo che possiamo leggere tra le righe. Ecco, credo che tra le righe possiamo individuare il segnale che presto
oggi in giornata.
si
Io però alle
tornerà
2:30 devo
alla
stare collegata
normalità.
per forza.
Abbiamo un'incursione vocale, forse che
No,
impedisce.
è iniziato,
Leggerei
sì, è
appunto
iniziato, non è iniziato tutto il programma,
Stefania
però già
Prisco.
oggi e domani c'è un convegno. In realtà pure mo stamattina
Penso
sto collegata, ma
Stefania
stamattina non mi
Prisco.
interessa di un
È
cazzo.
Stefania Prisco.
Infatti dopo mi seguo la lezione del professore. No, oggi pomeriggio ci sono 4 interventi che mi interessano per il progetto della
se
tesi.
disattiva l'audio, un attimo che cerco di...
Quindi, no, in realtà da girare stamattina ti volevo chiamare, cioè ieri sera ti volevo avvisare, ho detto, ma tanto Davide, figurati se non c'è. Davide ha detto, no, domani mattina...
Prego, Claudio.
Sì,
Vuoi?
grazie, grazie mille. Niente, io concludo semplicemente augurando buon lavoro a tutti i relatori e a chi seguirà le sessioni di questo convegno, dandoci sin da ora l'appuntamento, spero insomma che sia una speranza che non resti delusa, alla prossima occasione quando sicuramente ci troveremo in presenza e il piacere di ritrovarci sarà sicuramente raddoppiato. Buon lavoro a tutti e grazie.
Ringrazio anche a nome di tutti appunto il professor Toscani per questo suo affettuoso intervento. Lo sentiamo sempre molto vicino, partecipi. Ricordiamo appunto i suoi interessi che volgono anche verso appunto il Settecento. Il professor Toscani ha partecipato a convegni nostri organizzati in passato, soprattutto riferiti alle edizioni di musica del Settecento. E ci fa piacere appunto che dagli studi portati avanti all'interno del conservatorio sia nato ancora, abbiamo contribuito appunto a riportare l'interesse su tanti musicisti così prestigiosi, importanti, come Leonardo Vinci, come appunto Nicola Porto. Quindi appunto un piccolo frutto appunto anche di questo nostro interesse, ci fa piacere che sia registrato e che dunque anche grazie al nostro merito, tra virgolette, questi grandi compositori del passato siano tornati a circolare con le loro musiche in tutto il mondo. Grazie ancora al professor Toscani e do la parola per presiedere la prima sessione al professor Maccherino che appunto inaugurerà la sessione mattutina di oggi con le relazioni del professor Griffin, di Charles Hyde, di appunto Bertold Over. Grazie di nuovo. Prego, Nicolò.
Grazie Gaetano. Io purtroppo mi scuso, sono davvero mortificato, ma non so cosa sia successo alla mia telecamera, per cui pazienza, sentirete soltanto la voce, almeno stamattina. Non lo so cosa sia successo alla mia telecamera. Comunque, va bene. Io ovviamente ringrazio tutti coloro i quali, appunto, gli studiosi in primis, in pratica il conservatorio, la direzione che ci dà la possibilità, insomma, di fare questi studi, le società che hanno appunto voluto anche, come dire, patrocinare il nostro convegno. Ovviamente un saluto particolare, insomma, anche a Rosalind Alton, permettetemelo, insomma, che si collega dall'Australia, insomma, che ha voluto fortemente, insomma, essere con noi. Sono molto felice perché oltre, diciamo, a colleghi, diciamo, che per la prima volta partecipano al nostro convegno, ve ne sono altri, appunto, come il professor Thomas Griffin, che appunto ritornano, insomma, a partecipare ai nostri convegni. E proprio il convegno in pratica ha inizio proprio con la relazione, appunto, di Thomas Griffin. Conosciamo tutti gli studi che lui ha compiuto e, diciamo, l'importanza, diciamo, le conseguenze storico-musicali, insomma, che hanno portato. Lui stamattina ci intratterrà, appunto, con una relazione davvero, credo, interessante e anche nuova, cioè le implicazioni in pratica tra l'insegnamento della storia della musica in pratica nell'ambito appunto dell'età della forma sonata, quindi nell'ambito dell'età, insomma, degli autori, insomma, che riguardano appunto la seconda metà in pratica del XVIII secolo. Per cui lo ringrazio e prego, lo invito in pratica a iniziare la sua relazione. Grazie. Thomas, prego. A posto siamo. Io non mi vedo. Thomas non si sente. Siamo però... Thomas, non sentiamo la tua voce.
Nicolò, scusa,
Dimmi.
in attesa che il professor Griffin riesca a risolvere i suoi problemi, non puoi tu, sulla base dell'abstract che ti ha inviato, dirci qualcosa? Oppure riesci a entrare in contatto direttamente con Thomas Griffin per cercare di capire cosa accade.
Bene, lui, insomma, dovrebbe concentrare il suo intervento sul trionfo, appunto, della musica strumentale alla fine del Settecento, dovuto anche ai numerosi progressi raggiunti dai compositori dell'opera italiana, iniziando prima con, appunto, i compositori napoletani e seguito presto anche da altri diciamo, autori in pratica del tempo, e soprattutto aiutati anche appunto da autori che erano vicini a Pietro Metastasio. Opere italiane in pratica di autori come Johann Adolf Hasse, Antonio Sacchini, Giuseppe Sarti, Domenico Cimarosa, lo stesso Paisiello, sino ad arrivare, insomma, alla nascita, e che hanno determinato anche la nascita di capolavori strumentali come Haydn, Mozart, di Haydn, Mozart e Beethoven. E fra l'altro in pratica lui si sta occupando, insomma, assieme ad Alvaro Torrente a Madrid, cercando di mettere su un corpus, appunto, di musiche che sono associate ai testi di opera metastasiana, e se ne parlerà nel corso di un convegno che avrà luogo a Madrid il prossimo maggio, e che purtroppo doveva, appunto, essere come dire, celebrato l'anno scorso, ma non è stato possibile. Thomas, hai riattivato l'audio? No, niente.
Forse consigliagli di scollegarsi e di provare a collegarsi di nuovo.
Thomas, mi suggerisce Gaetano di scollegarti e di ricollegarti nuovamente.
Casomai intanto
Altrimenti io direi di cominciare, di passare
facciamo
eventualmente la
intervenire
parola al professor Over,
e appunto.
e magari in attesa di sistemare Thomas Griffin in pratica il suo audio, se siete d'accordo.
Va bene, dai.
Sei d'accordo, Thomas? Ok. Se è d'accordo il professor Over, che finalmente conosco anche di persone, che ringrazio vivamente, insomma, di prendere parte al nostro convegno. Grazie. Lui ci ha salutati, insomma, dalla lontana Germania, insomma. Io parlo dalla lontanissima Sicilia, quindi, insomma, questa è la bellezza anche diciamo, degli incontri che la musicologia, insomma, mette assieme. Allora, il professor Over ovviamente anche lui, di lui conoscete, insomma, i risultati accademici, gli studi, insomma, che ha portato e che sta ancora conducendo. Tra l'altro autore di scoperte interessanti, in pratica di autografi sconosciuti di Antonio Vivaldi, dello stesso Handel e di Gustav Mahler. Lui oggi ci parlerà appunto di un Vivan pure i pasticceri, questo è il titolo. Il terzo atto è appunto nelle opere pastiche. E quindi, insomma, partendo dal presupposto che dell'importanza che ha questo genere, che è la pratica appunto di questo particolare genere musicale, il terzo atto rappresenta il momento culminante dell'azione con catastrofe, e quindi porterà avanti, in pratica appunto ci farà entrare nell'ambito delle sue ricerche, incentrando in pratica la sua appunto relazione su capolavori appunto di Georg Friedrich Händel e di altri autori, molto spesso anche su testi metastasiani che sono stati appunto come dire pasticciati, così come dice lui. Quindi invito e prego il professor Bertolt Over in pratica a illustrare in pratica il suo lavoro. Grazie.
Sì, grazie mille per l'introduzione. Io parlerò in inglese, ma potete anche fare le domande in italiano, così non c'è problema con la comunicazione. Allora devo condividere lo schermo. Ecco, vedete tutto?
Sì, io sì.
Ok, va bene. Dunque, vivan puri pasticceri, the third act in pasticcio operas. Vivan puri pasticceri. This cry of admiration and esteem is taken from a libretto by Carlo Goldoni, where he describes the efforts of some singers to form a pasticcio. Because their carriage is broken, they are forced to spend a day in an inn. They try several areas and ensembles, besides enmeshing themselves in love intrigues. The libretto, called appropriately Il Pasticcio, Dramma Giocoso per Musica, shows clearly the practical side of creating such a piece of music. In fact, current research considers the pasticcio more and more not a genre, but a practice. This pasticcio practice, with this assemblage of pre-existing music coming from different sources, or its enrichment of pre-existing operas with foreign musical material, can be described as a technique of compilation and modification, which is equally effective and artful. By the way, this conforms to the notion of the culinary pasticcio of the time, which assembles the best ingredients to form a new gustatory experience and is not a cheap recycling of remains. The deliberative choice of musical material at specific dramaturgical points makes it possible to uncover strategies of musical arrangement, singers' self-fashioning, and public appeal, amongst others. Looking at the third act, which forms the focus of the conference, it must be retained that it concludes the action as well as the operatic event or the entire musical evening entertainment, and thus has a specific role. In spoken tragedy, the final act contains the catastrophe and the denouement. In its musical equivalent, the opera seria, it is mostly followed by an additional event, the lieto fine. The clavetic of the action in the third act, with its focus on tragic events, denouement, and happy ending, may be complemented by a climactic arrangement of music. The pasticcio practice enables a free choice of musical material that may deviate from the original conception of an opera to a great extent. In the singer-songwriter approach of 18th century operatic practice in general, we must have the appearance and staging of the singers in the third act. Are they singled out? Do they show special musical features, or are they presented with a certain ability? However, these strategies may not only be valid for the third, but may also be found in the other two acts of an opera or pasticcio. But because the third act marks the last appearance of the singers, and as we know, the most recent appearance may last longer in our memory, the music presented has a special quality. If we have a look at the different strategies to single out singers, we can classify them as follows. The third act as a showcase, a concluding virtuoso aria as a showcase of a single singer, singularization of a singer in the third act with a virtuoso aria, special aria forms. So let us have a look at the first point, the third act as a virtuoso showcase. I've shown elsewhere that the third act in Catone, a pasticcio Handel put on stage in London in 1732, is arranged in this way. The original opera, Leonardo Leo's Catone in Utica, was itself not given in its original form, but as an opera impasticciata. It was modified through the insertion of other musical material. In the third act, some arias were replaced. Since we do not know the original versions of the arias by Leo, we cannot determine shifts in musical style or mode. But this is possible with Handel's pasticcio. In Act 1 and 2, the arias replaced often referred to Leo's arias by using similar tempo, motives, and melodic lines. Of course, there are also arias independent from this pattern. But in Act 3, the musical layout was completely remodeled. Almost every character sings a virtuoso aria here, making the act a musical climax, enabling the singers to end their operatic appearance with vocal fireworks and thus astonishing the audience in a breathtaking way. You see it here. I've classified the areas. I will come back on this later. And you see that most of the singers receive a virtuoso aria instead of an aria which is less demanding vocally. This intentional deviation from the original conception makes clear that pasticcios may allow a much freer and purposeful arrangement of music and the realization of or testing of musical sheets not so common to opera. Whereas opera is often bound to the combination of literary ambition and musical materialization, the pasticcio normally does not know these chains. Starting from the observations on Catone, my paper will consider other pasticcios. Is it possible to expect similar strategies? Can we perceive similar concluding effects? Is the third act different from the other two? The experimental design comprises pasticcios arranged by Handel, as well as such by the Mingotti opera troupe. 6 of them can be compared best because they are based on the same librettos by Pietro Metastasio. Didona Abbandonata, Catone in Utica, and Artaserse, which in Handel's performance became Arbace. While comparing the areas, a categorization is needed. My categorization is somewhat arbitrary and certainly does not reflect all musical characteristics of an area or its dramaturgical implications. The classification shall be done with regard to the vocal complexity of the pieces. Now, doesn't it work? Virtuoso areas. These are areas with difficult coloraturas. Areas with coloraturas are not so complex than virtuoso areas. Most syllabic areas have coloraturas occasionally and in small number. Syllabic areas do not have coloraturas. At first glance, the third act seems to be very different in every pasticcio, but Handel's Didone has a similar conception as Catone. There are virtuoso areas for almost all the singers of the cast. Exceptions are Francesca Bartoldi and John Baird, and Domenica Annibali has two, Mitradini in Firasorte and Cadraffa Poco in Cenere. The first by Giovanni Alberto Ristori from his cantata in commemoration of the coronation of Anna Ivanovna, Tsarina of Russia. This comes from Versi Cantati in Varsavia from 1736 and has another text, Quel pastor chiunendo al suono. And the second aria from Johann Adolf Hasse's Caio Fabricio, Rome, 1732. The text here is also altered. The original one is Non sempre guarda forte. It seems that Annibali inserted classical suitcase areas in the third act. It is clear that he premiered the second aria in Rome and sang it also in the Dresden performance of Hasse's opera in 1734. And it seems probable that he premiered the first one too. Annibali was employed at the Saxon court in Dresden, and the cantata was performed in Warsaw, the Polish residence of Augustus III, who at the same time was Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. Be that as it may, the conception of Handel's version of Vinci's Didone Abbandonata is not really significant, because already Vinci conceived the third act as a virtuoso showcase. You see the classification of the areas, and they are almost identical to that what Handel did. The second possibility, a concluding virtuoso aria as a showcase of a single singer. Like in Catone, the concluding piece in Arpace is a virtuoso aria added to the pasticcio and preceding the final choir. Tedenio non sarei. According to Reinhard Strom, this aria should replace the choir, but the score as well as the libretto show both, and there are no cancellations or other hints to support this assumption. In fact, the clue Fine dell'opera appears only after the chorus Giusto re la Persiadora. Other clues are puzzling, however, whereas in the score we find the hint Arpace aria. After the final recitative vocal part of the aria appears the inscription Tutti. This may refer to the possible intention to combine these two pieces and to consider them a solo with choir. Although they are not in the same key, the aria is in A, the choir in D major, the tonal relationship, the fifth to the first, does not impede such a combination. Another explanation could be that all characters are on stage and form the tutti. But because of its clearly soloistic character, it seems not probable that all singers should sing the aria, especially as the libretto too assigns an aria to Arpace preceding the choir. However, the aria in the libretto is not Di Tedenio non sarei, but Son qual nave che agitata, which appears in the score of the pasticcio at the end of the first act and replaces Vinci's Vos solcandum mar crudele. Handel had already used this aria in Catone as a final aria, so that it must be replaced. Son qual nave che agitata is an aria text that was associated with Carlo Broschi's or Farinelli's name some months later, when he sang it in the pasticcio Artaserse, based on Hasse's opera, which premiered in Venice in 1730. Most probably, he inserted it in the setting by his brother Riccardo Broschi, who apparently wrote Son qual nave especially for Carlo, who may have inserted it for the first time in a revival of Hasse's opera in Lucca in the same year, 1730. The aria appears here at the end of Act 1 with an asterisk. It was sung by Farinelli, who impersonated the role of Arpace. In London, Artaserse was premiered on 29 October 1734, after Arpace, and produced by the rival opera of the nobility. Farinelli's decision to include his brother's version of the aria may have been a reaction to the earlier one in Arpace. In Arpace, the aria was originally intended as a final piece for Giovanni Carestini, as the libretto makes clear, but then it was removed to the end of Act 1, where it appears in the score, as already mentioned. The aria is not by Riccardo Broschi, and two concordant scores name Domenico Alberti as its composer. Carestini's aria is similar to Qual Guerrier in Campo Armato, sung by Farinelli in his Brothers Idaspe, performed in Venice in 1730, and points to a certain rivalry between the two singers. Here you see the incipits by the pieces by Domenico Alberti and Riccardo Broschi. They are very similar. The strategy to end an operatic event with a bravura aria is also evident from the score of Catone, where a virtuoso aria for Anna Maria Strada was added, together with a short recitative. In the first thought, Leo's Soffre Talor del Vento, originally sung by Domenico Gizzi in Catone in Utica in Act 2, Scene 5, as the first version of the recitative and the clue Segue l'aria, Soffre Talor makes clear. You see it here on the screen. But finally, the recitative was modified to fit Leonardo Vinci's Vos solcando un mar crudele from Artaserse, first performed in Rome in 1730 by Caffarelli. The third possibility, singularization of a singer with a virtuoso aria within the third act. Within the act, a virtuoso aria can emphasize a certain singer. This strategy is frequently found in the pasticcios by the Mingotti troupe, where a singer appears with a brilliant aria around the middle of the third act. In Catone in Utica, Caterina Beret sings Combattuta da tante vicende. In Di Dona Abbandonata, Regina Valentini, L'Augeletto in Lacci Stretto, and in Artaserse, there are two virtuoso arias, Giovanna della Stella's Agitato il mio cor si confonde, and Francesco Arrigoni's Figlio se più non vivi. The fourth possibility, special aria forms. Special aria forms, like arias in two tempos or parlante arias, or duets, can also single out singers. In Mingotti's Catone in Utica, Rosa Costa sings Un labrum cor non ve, that oscillates between a moderate and a fast tempo. Giovanna della Stella is singled out by the highly effective parlante aria Si cerca si dice from Pergolesi's Olimpiade, Rome 1735, which ends with a presto passage. In the troupe's Artaserse, the prima donnas Rosa Costa and Giovanna della Stella sing the duet Tu vuoi ch'io viva o cara from Leonardo Vinci's eponymous opera, Rome 1730, a piece that is also found in Handel's Arbace and thus appears to be a kind of a favorite piece. The results of the comparison of these 6 pasticcios may be summarized as follows. Handel's conception of the third act seems to be more climactic when he arranged the arias as a brilliant firework or adds an additional final aria. The Mingottis, in contrast, seem to single out 1 or 2 singers, not at the end, as Handel often does, but around the middle of the third act. However, these observations are made on the basis of only few scores, and the results should be proved by a broader choice of operas and pasticcios. But a glance on 3 more pasticcios show that they may be valid. In Handel's pasticcio Semiramide, all arias were scaled down for some of the singers, and for Carestini scaled up. In comparison to the original opera by Vinci, the new arias for Maria Caterina and Maria Rosa Negri were less demanding. Carlos Calzi's, Margherita Durastantes, and Anna Maria Strada's arias remained. Carestini inserted Vinci's brilliant virtuoso aria Sin Campo Armato from Catone in Utica, which he sang in the Roman premiere in 1728, and which is more complex than the original aria Odi quel fasto. Moreover, to underline his predominant role, he got the additional aria Un'aura placida at the end of the piece, that is, between the 2 final choirs. He had premiered this aria in Giovanni Porta's Janguir, Milan, 1732. It is no coincidence that Carestini's role was enhanced. He appeared in London in Semiramide for the first time. On the contrary, the shape and position of his arias shows that he should or wanted to be presented to the audience in the most sensational way. Handel's strategy in Caio Fabrizio from 1733 is far less obvious because there are no areas which could be classified as virtuoso in the third act. But here too, Carestini receives an additional area before the final choir, marking his special status in the cast. Vorrei darci sciogliere from Demetrio by Leonardo Leo, Naples 1732, and premiered not by him, but by Teresa Cotti. If we have a look at the Mingotti troupe, their patterns too are confirmed. In Demetrio, from 1744, there is only one virtuoso area in the third act, Non fidi al mar che freme, by an unknown composer, but sung by Regina Valentini. Once more, the future star singer receives a virtuoso area in the last act to be able to impress the audience. We already noticed that Vinci's third act of Di Donna Abbandonata is conceived as a virtuoso showcase, so that this strategy is also present in normal opera. Other objects of comparison must be the other two acts of an opera and pasticcio. I already stated that the areas chosen to be inserted in Catone refer to the original music in the first two acts, whereas the third act was remodeled as a musical climax as shown. If we have a look at the first and second acts of Arpace and Artaserse, the remodeling is not so obvious as in the third act, than in the third act of both pasticcios. In Handel's Arpace, yes, the end of the first act was changed, Anna Maria Strada receiving a virtuoso area instead of one with coloraturas in the B section only. As mentioned, Giovanni Carestini's Volcando in Mars Crudele was exchanged by Son qual nave che agitata, which does not alter the vocal profile of the role at this specific point. In the second act, areas for Strada and Calzi were exchanged, which are more virtuosic than the original ones and enhanced their roles. Looking at the Mingotti troupe's Artaserse, we can observe the following. In contrast to the third act, where a virtuoso area is placed around the middle of the act, Artaserse contains such areas in the first two acts at prominent points, at the ends of the acts. Moreover, the first act is opened by a virtuoso area for Rosa Costa. But this conception is only partly followed in other pasticcios. For example, in Catone in Utica, the first act ends with a virtuoso area, Guerrier d'incontro fiero by Paolo Scalabrini, and the second one is placed in the middle of the second act, Vedi il nocchiere la sponda by Hasse. So I come to the end. To sum up, the third act in pasticcios can have different functions as evidenced by a comparison between pasticcios by George Frederick Handel and the Mingotti opera troupe. Whereas Handel uses the possibilities a flexible musical choice provides to enhance a single singer or all singers of this cast, the Mingotti troupe is more restrained and normally singles out a singer around the middle of the act. We may therefore conclude that the Mingotti troupe is rather conventional, whereas Handel plays through his purposeful arrangement of the music with concepts of musical culmination and strategies of musical dramaturgy. So, thank you very much.
Nicolò.
Sì, ringraziamo e ringrazio in pratica il professor Over per questa illuminante, interessante relazione, insomma, così illuminante anche per capire un po' come un grande autore come Handel in pratica organizzava appunto soprattutto il terzo atto, anche il rapporto appunto con la compagnia Mingotti. Se qualcuno ha desiderio insomma di fare domande o di colloquiare con il professor Over, può ovviamente farlo. Io continuo a scusarmi, ma non riesco a risolvere il problema con la mia videocamera. Dovrei disconnettermi e poi rientrare, ma non mi sembra il caso di farlo ora in questo momento. Qualcuno vuol rivolgere domande al professor Over?
Allora, approfitto per chiedere al professor Over qualcosa riguardante l'opera che sarà poi oggetto di un mio intervento ossia il cartone in utica, che viene dato, come leggevo dal frontespizio del libretto che ha fatto vedere, a Londra nel 1732. Il terzo atto, appunto, che mi sembra, se non ho capito male, terminasse con l'aria affidata a Marzia, un'aria virtuosistica. Quindi, appunto, questo pasticcio terminava ovviamente con il suicidio di Carone e poi seguiva l'aria di Marzia virtuosistica. Riportava in qualche modo un lieto fine questo pasticcio e si basava su musica di Vinci, o in che cosa consisteva l'intervento di Handel, se non ho capito male. Grazie.
Sì, è un po' strano che quest'aria è stata aggiunta al pasticcio perché il tragico fine è unico per quest'opera. C'è anche la Didona abbandonata, ma è veramente un caso speciale. No? Per dire il vero, di aggiungere un'aria e di fare una specie di lieto fine non è un lieto fine, perché Marzia dice: ma io faccio vendetta. A mio parere non fa senso, ma riflette la strategia di esponere una cantante, di esponere Anna Maria Strana, che ha anche in questo atto un'aria virtuosistica, come anche la sua rivale Emilia Celeste Gismondi, che era venuta da Napoli e prima di essere a Londra cantava in Intermezzi, il suo nome è Celeste. Anche lei aveva un'aria virtuosistica, dunque io penso che queste due cantanti dovevano essere una specie di rival queens, perché ambedue avevano queste arie che non erano state messe nel pasticcio in un modo molto distante, perché ci sono 2 o 3 scene che vanno dall'una all'altra. Dunque è stato possibile di comparare, di fare una comparazione di queste due cantanti attraverso queste arie. Dunque io penso che questa è stata la ragione di mettere un'aria finale al pasticcio.
Ok, grazie. L'ultima cosa, l'aggiunta di un'aria virtuosistica brillante veniva anche nel caso in cui il terzo atto del pasticcio presentasse un coro consolatorio, oppure è un fatto eccezionale?
No, si può anche fare con il coro. Ci sono alcuni esempi dove c'è un'aria virtuosistica, poi c'è il coro che conclude l'opera, ma l'aria virtuosistica è aggiunta.
Ok, grazie.
Si può anche fare con il coro, o anche c'è un coro, c'è l'aria virtuosistica e poi c'è un altro coro. Anche questo è possibile.
Ok, grazie. Qualcun altro vuole intervenire ponendo domande al professor Over? Nessuno si fa avanti. Ok. Io a questo punto ringrazio ancora il professor Over per l'interessante davvero intervento, facendoci, insomma, mettendo a segno, insomma, alcune scoperte, insomma, alcune analisi e su come appunto Handel e la compagnia appunto Mingotti elaboravano. Tra l'altro l'intervento finale di oggi, insomma, quello di Kern Charside, che ho visto che è già arrivato e che saluto, appunto riguarderà un altro pasticcio appunto scusate, un'altra opera di Handel. E desideravo ora sapere se Thomas Griffin ha per caso risolto i suoi problemi di audio, perché io i miei di video non li ho risolti. Tu hai risolto i tuoi problemi di audio, Thomas? Hai l'audio disconnesso?
Nicolò, senti, se mi posso permettere,
Sì.
casomai appunto consiglia al professor Griffin di provare la sua connessione con qualcuno che conosce indipendentemente dal convegno e poi la sua relazione la spostiamo in un'altra sessione.
Lui ti sente, quindi non c'è bisogno che io faccia da intermediario.
Siccome appunto non riesco a...
Voglio dire...
Se tu appunto...
Can you hear me?
Ecco
No.
qua, ecco.
Sentiamo,
Prego.
Can you hear me now?
Ok, thank you. Ti ascoltiamo. Ok, perfetto.
The paper that I have is not really a research paper like Professor Overs. It's more of a hypothesis. I hope you don't mind me speaking English. I'll speak lentamente. The idea is that if you teach the history of music, you start out with the Middle Ages, then you go to the Renaissance, then the Baroque period, then the 18th and the 19th century, so forth. So when you're in the Middle Ages, what do you talk about? Well, you talk about what emerges then in that period. For example, Gregorian chant, the beginnings of musical notation. Then you move on to, let's say, the Renaissance. Well, what do you talk about then? You don't talk about Gregorian chant anymore, even though it does continue into the period. You talk about the Netherlands and the efflorescence of polyphonic music. Then you move on to the Baroque period, and that's where you talk about opera, the beginnings of opera, the basso continuo, the cantatas, oratorios. And then you move on to the 17th, the 18th, and the 19th century. You know, in English, we say 18th century, meaning Settecento. So the Settecento, what is happening there? Well, some universities and conservatives talk about classical music in the Settecento. The Novecento is romantic music. That really doesn't work very well, though, because the 18th century, the Settecento, is much more complicated than that. Alessandro Scarlatti, the last of the great Italian Baroque composers, dies in 1725, and he's already been very active the first quarter of that century. So the Baroque period doesn't end with 1700, it goes on for how long? Well, Bach, J.S. Bach dies in 1750. So the first half of the century is sometimes said to be the half century of Johann Sebastian Bach, and the second half of the century, the 18th century, is the period of Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Well, that doesn't work very well either. What I think the whole 18th century is really a century of Italian opera, Metastasian opera. If you think about Charles Burney, typical 18th century personality, who does he think is important? Well, it's Metastasio, the poet, and the composers that set him, including the ones we're talking about today. But I think he especially likes Hasse. Johann Adolf Hasse was his great hero. So if you're studying 18th century music, according to Burney, you'd be studying Metastasio and Hasse. Then what is really important for music history, I think, is the emergence of the sonata form in the last 3 decades of that century, 1770s, 80s, and 90s. That's, well, sometimes it's called the sonata allegro form or just the sonata form, the one that is used in the symphonies of Haydn, the last symphonies of Mozart, and of course, the sonatas of Beethoven and many other composers. How does this relate to what we're studying here? Well, my hypothesis is that none of that would have happened. The sonata form would not have happened except for the advances that are made by the Italian operas in Italy, in Germany, in Vienna, in all of the empire, and even in England to a certain extent with Handel. Can I prove that? Well, no, that would be, you know, lifetimes of work. I can't prove it, but I think it will be proven by the Spaniards, by Alvaro Torrente and his project that's now going on in Madrid. You've probably heard of it. It's the Didone, Project Didone, they call it. And let me read to you what it's really about. The source of absolute music mapping emotions in the 18th century Italian opera. So they are identifying all of the Metastasian operas with libretti and with scores. And they're also putting it into computer readable form with Music XML, which is a coding system. It's tedious work, but they've got money for it. EU money, in fact. So I think we're going to be able to find some really concrete evidence within the next year or two if they are able to pull this off. If you look at the web, they've got a page where they have been recording their seminars, and it's pretty interesting. I would take a look at it if I were you, interested. At least I am, because I have a computer background as a programmer. So that's basically what I'm talking about. I think the important thing with the sonata allegro form is the emergence of modern tonality, or common practice tonality, as you probably want to call it, because it's not really modern anymore. It's 18th century tonality. That's what makes the symphonies of Haydn, Mozart, Beethoven really work, along with the idea of development, Entwicklung, as the Germans call it. I think those things can be found already in the Italian opera. Jomelli strikes me as very important here. But we'll see when they come up with their actual concrete evidence. Haydn, of course, is often mentioned as the important figure. He certainly taught Mozart how to do Entwicklung, development, but I think somebody might have taught Haydn these things, and I think it came out of the Italian opera tradition that he worked as a opera conductor for many years, and so did a lot of other people. So I think we can find the origins of instrumental music in the 18th century, really from looking at Italian opera. But again, we'll see what the Spanish come up with in a few years. Anyway, it's just a hypothesis of mine, but I think we'll be able to find a real answer pretty soon. That's essentially what I had to say. I would recommend you take a look at Project Didone's homepage on the web and listen to some of their seminars. It's quite interesting how they're working at it. You have to speak Spanish in many cases, sometimes in English. None of them are talking Italian, from what I gather. Any questions?
I don't know if my sound is on.
Yeah, Rosalind.
Hi, yep.
Hi.
I feel also that it's the orchestration of Italian opera style, and particularly the types of orchestration that became identified with storm pieces, storm virtuoso arias, if you like, and the types of virtuoso orchestral writing that developed alongside virtuoso vocal writing in the opera.
Well, that, you know, Haydn went through a period of that in the 60s and 70s. Then he started publishing his instrumental music. Before that, he wrote operas, of course, also for the Esterhazy, but they belonged to the prince, so he couldn't make them public. He did start in the 1770s, and I think that's when Mozart first picked up on the development, the idea of the development. What little I've seen of Jomelli strikes me as very interesting. He writes excellent instrumental music for the accompaniment, and he's also, well, if you read Reinhard Strom's book on opera, he mentions that Jomelli often repeated words. He didn't like the long verses that Metastasio wrote. Metastasio criticized him for taking apart his music, breaking it up, developing it in a sense. So I think Jomelli was very important. Maybe Tommaso Traetta also. I haven't seen much of his music, really.
Grazie Thomas. Qualcun altro vuol porre domande al professor Griffin?
Intervengo io, anche se devo dire francamente la mia conoscenza dell'inglese parlato è molto superficiale. Spero di non
sei il solo.
Chiedere cose su cui il professor Griffin è già intervenuto. Ho sentito tante volte dal professor Griffin citare il nome di Metastasio. In che modo Metastasio influisce sulla musica strumentale, non solo italiana, di fine Settecento, inizio Ottocento, se c'è un suo influsso anche percepibile in queste forme strumentali? Grazie.
Well, Metastasio obviously is the major poet all throughout the 18th century. How many operas did he write? Well, I have a number here somewhere, but they were set by hundreds of composers, I think. So what the Alvaro Torrente, and one of their jobs is to find these libretti and find out what the scores, where they were performed, who wrote them, that sort of thing. Yeah, Metastasio is the key, I think. And many other composers, of course. Haydn set a few of Metastasio's operas, in fact. So did Mozart, even.
Ok, grazie.
Se posso, Gaetano, su quello che chiedevi tu. Strom, mi pare verso la fine degli anni 60, inizi anni 70, provò a mettere i versi di Metastasio sotto temi di concerto in maggior parte di pianoforti per pianoforte di Mozart, e tornava benissimo, quasi pensassero in versi, alle volte verso tedesco, alle volte verso italiano. In realtà poi in parte qualcosa del genere aveva già fatto Momigny agli inizi dell'Ottocento nel suo corso di composizione. Quindi dal punto di vista metrico-ritmico c'è abbastanza coincidenza o influenza tra quello che è il metro poetico e appunto il metro ritmo musicale, dei motivi musicali.
Ok, grazie Francesca. Chi vuole intervenire? Qualche altra domanda? Va bene, ok. Allora ringraziamo il professor Thomas Griffin per il suo intervento e passiamo insomma alla prossima relazione. Grazie quindi Thomas. Kerry dovrebbe essere... eccola, sì, la vedo. Hai l'audio disattivato. Perfetto, benissimo, ti sentiamo. Ok, grazie. Bentornata, perché Kerry aveva già partecipato ad un nostro convegno, insomma aveva collaborato attivamente, insomma, e lo fa anche a distanza, perché ci sentiamo anche molto di frequente. Sappiamo anche il lavoro che lei svolge in pratica presso il Royal Birmingham Conservatorio, e quindi insomma il contributo che lei dà insomma, per la diffusione, la conoscenza della musica italiana. Anche la relazione di stamattina appunto riguarderà un grande compositore tedesco, poi insomma naturalizzato in inglese, e il terzo atto dell'opera appunto di questa opera composita, il Muzio Scevola, andato in scena nel 1721 con musiche di Amadei e Bononcini, e il terzo atto è composto da Georg Friedrich Händel. A lei in pratica il compito di narrarci questa esperienza, questa avventura. Grazie.
Grazie. Perdonatemi se parlo in inglese, ma non sono così brava in italiano, purtroppo. So I'll try to speak quite slowly, and I'm hoping that the audio works as well. I've never played audio over Zoom before, so we'll keep on. Incrociamo le dita. So, my paper today is very much a work in progress. It's the beginning of a much larger project, creating a critical edition of Muzio Scevola for the Hessische Handel-Ausgabe. These are kind of very preliminary thoughts. They're a little bit fuzzy, and I'm just kind of bringing them together and presenting them to you. Yeah, it's still not quite fully formed, but it's quite useful. It's been a really useful opportunity. So thank you very much, Nicola and Gaetano, for inviting me. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with what is perhaps not one of his best known works, Muzio Scevola is a composite opera. So Act 1 was written by Filippo Amadei, Act 2 by Giovanni Bononcini, and Act 3 by Handel. And this makes it a somewhat unusual and interesting case study when considering the operatic third act in the 18th century. All three acts were written by the same librettist, Paolo Antonio Rolli, but Handel only set the final act. So first, a very brief introduction to the work. So Muzio Scevola was written for the 1720-21 season of the Royal Academy. The first performance was on April the 15th, 1721, and there were 10 performances in total. Other works in the season included Bononcini's Astarto and Ciro, a revival of Handel's Radamisto, and Orlandini's Arsace, which was arranged by Amadei. As you can see from their birth dates, there is a generation gap between the older Amadei and Bononcini and the younger Handel. Indeed, Laura Lindgren describes the 50-year-old Bononcini as venerable and his musical style at this point as antiquated. Now, there is a succession of operatic libretti on the subject of Muzio Scevola dating back to the middle of the 17th century, and Bononcini himself had set versions of the story previously. Other scholars are currently undertaking some excellent work on the relationship between these different versions, so that's not something that I'm going to look at today. For our purposes, though, Rolli's libretto is set by the three composers in 1721, was newly composed. The story is set in ancient Rome, and it's based on Livy's Ad Urbe Condita. And indeed, as Tony Hicks has noted, the libretto contains direct quotes from Livy presented in the score in quotation marks. So the libretto's in two languages, it's in English and Italian. And it tells you at the front that when you've got those quotation marks, it's a rigorosa traduzione dei colloqui riportati dall'istorico. So Rolli structures his 3 acts around what he calls 3 valorous actions described by Livy, which signalized the Roman bravery. So the background to this is the ousted King Tarquin's attempt to retake Rome, which is now a republic, supported by the king of Etruria, Porsena. In Act 1, Horatio stands firm against the enemy on the Sublician Bridge. In Act 2, Muzio Scaevola burns his own right hand in a fire in an act of integrity after mistakenly killing a secretary rather than Porsena. And in Act 3, Clelia and the virgins launch themselves into the Tiber amidst a sea of arrows rather than submit to Porsena. So it is, of course, the 3rd act that's of interest to us today. This is where Rolli takes the most poetic license. It's the act that's the furthest removed from Livy. It is telling that, whilst large portions of Muzio's speech in the 2nd act appear within those quotation marks that I've just shown you, there's only one brief moment in the 3rd act that directly quotes Livy. Instead, the focus moves largely away from historical events and towards the untangling of star-crossed lovers. As we can see from the list of characters given at the outset of the libretto, Clelia is real, but the other females are largely poetic inventions. Indeed, Fidalma, who is Clelia's confidante, was cut altogether in subsequent productions. So Livy's description of Clelia's act of bravery is as follows. Wherefore, seeing valour so much esteemed, so having seen what Muzio has just done, the women too were excited to public acts of courage. Clelia, a virgin, being one of the hostages, when the Etrurian camp was happily pitched not far from the banks of Tiber, got from her keepers, and in the head of a whole troop of virgins swam over the Tiber amidst the darts of the enemies, returning all her companions safe to their friends at Rome. Which when Porsena heard of, he was at first incensed with anger, and sent certain envoys to Rome to demand his hostage Clelia, for he did not greatly value any of the rest. Then, being rapt with admiration, he said her action outdid all the Cocleses and the Mucci, and pretended how that if his hostage were not delivered up, he would look upon the league as broken, but if she were, he would send her home again unviolated. They kept their words on both sides, for the Romans restored the pledge of peace, i.e. Clelia and the other virgins, according to the league, and in the court of the Etrurian king, their virtue was not only safeguarded, but honoured also. So in Livy's account then, Clelia's bravery is the pivotal act towards which the whole story's been working up to. According to Porsena, her action outdid that of both Horatio and Muzio Scaevola. And it's the female action that ultimately saves the day. However, Rolli adapts Livy's version in order to fit the conventions of 18th century opera, which expect tricky romantic relationships that are only resolved at the last minute. So in Rolli's version, Porsena's admiration becomes his infatuation with Clelia. In Act 3, Scene 1, he offers her his hand in marriage. So you see, vedi un re che sospira ed amante offre a te la destra e il regno. He is, however, rebuffed by Clelia, who's already in love with Muzio, and the feeling is mutual. As a good Roman, honour bound, Muzio tries to convince Clelia to accept Porsena's hand in order to further Rome's cause and bring about peace. Clelia, however, is having none of it. So she says, Sire, tu non volesti dar fede ai miei detti, Muzio pensò di far forza agli affetti, il grandatto o merate, o a Roma, o a morte io voi v'ingannate. Thus, Clelia's noble act of throwing herself into the Tiber is no longer a heroic martial act, but the actions of a woman who's escaping an unwelcome marriage proposal. Indeed, the whole of the 3rd act is about love. Amadei and Bononcini are provided with martial scenes in the first 2 acts, thereby prompting a wide range of musical settings. Handel has the greatest number of arias, so he's got 12 compared to Amadei's 9 and Bononcini's 11, but they're all reflections on different aspects of love. So the act starts with the Muzio, Clelia, Porsena love triangle. Muzio reflects on the difficulty of being forced to choose between love and duty, later wishing for death to ease his suffering. Clelia describes the torments of love, whilst Porsena just can't wait to marry Clelia. After Clelia's escape, Muzio tries to convince the king to retain faith in love. Finally, when Muzio and Clelia have the chance to be together, Clelia displays the doubts of love. And the duet, Ma come amar, she wonders how she can trust Muzio after all of that, and whilst he insists that 'twas only fidelity made me false to my faith. Now, while the Muzio-Clelia-Porsena love situation is an invention, they are at least all characters that are mentioned in Livy. More poetic license is taken with a second love triangle, which centres around Porsena's daughter Irene, again a poetic addition. Her father has promised her to the tyrant Tarquinio, but she falls in love with Horatio, the hero of the first act. A significant proportion of the third act is devoted to this, accompanied by advice from Irene's companion Fidelma, who's clearly experienced in matters of love. So she warns Irene not to be fooled by love's desires, and she reflects on how annoying it is having to wait for a lover to return. Both Horatio and Irene have an aria in which they comment on the difficulty of being parted from their beloved. And the climax of this subplot is when Tarquinio accosts Irene and she calls on her father to rescue her from him in A dolce nome. The tension swiftly resolved, however, and Horatio and Irene are reunited in their love in the duet Vivo senz'alma. There clearly isn't time here today to look in detail at each aria and how it demonstrates this full spectrum of different kinds of love. Nevertheless, two brief examples will demonstrate how Handel takes these poetic prompts and creates vastly different musical responses. For example, in Dimmi crudele amore, we find a typical complaint about the cruelty of love. I mean, it's pretty standard, isn't it? Dimmi crudele amore, dimmi qual mai contento, a così fier tormento, egual to die. So here we get rushing semiquaver runs followed by really dramatic pauses that create an arresting opening for Clelia's rhetorical questioning, perfectly suited to her complaint. And fingers crossed this is going to work. On the other hand, in Vola, let's see. It was all going too well, wasn't it? Yes, there we go. On the other hand, in Volate più dei venti, Porsena expresses his desire for time to pass quickly so that he can be with his beloved Clelia in a setting that perfectly encapsulates those breezes of the text. Again, that's all pretty standard imagery, isn't it? Volate più dei venti momenti che scorrete innanzi al mio piacer. So I'll have a little snippet of this.
Volate più dei venti, momenti che scorrete, dinanzi al mio piacere, dinanzi al mio piacere. Momenti che scorrete, dinanzi al mio piacere. Volate più dei venti, momenti che scorrete, dinanzi al mio piacere. Volate.
Now, one particularly interesting aspect is the use of borrowing and revisions within this act. So John H. Roberts has already discussed in great detail Handel's borrowings in Muzio Scevola, particularly those from Pistocchi. Another interesting case is that of the aria A chi vive di speranza from Act 3, Scene 8. So here, Fidelma reflects on how annoying it is to have to wait for a lover to return. a chi vive di speranza quando è lungo l'aspettar, ogni breve lontananza quando s'ama fa penar. Now, Handel's original plan was to reuse an aria from the cantata Apollo e Daphne, Felicissima quest'alma. So you can see the text here. Felicissima quest'alma che ama sol la libertà. Non v'è pace, non v'è calma, per chi sciolto il cor non ha. So clearly the two texts are closely related structurally, both comprising 4 lines of ottanari with tronco endings at the end of each semistrophe, making it relatively easy to transfer one text over to the other. What is interesting is that the aria from Apollo e Daphne centers around the idea of liberty and love. These are the central themes of Muzio Scevola, both the political liberty of the Roman Republic, but also ultimately the freedom to follow your heart in love, rather than marrying strategically. In the words of the final chorus, si sarà più dolce amore con la cara libertà, liberalma e lieto core, son il ben di cui maggiore ai mortali il ciel non dà. Now, I don't want to start reading far too much into this, and obviously we're never going to know, but it may be that this kind of word association, as well as the similarity in poetic structure, prompted Handel to think of reusing this aria. As you'll hear from the example, this reworked version is very close indeed to the original. So what I'm going to try and play you, hope it's not too confusing. So the audio is from Apollo and Daphne, and the score is from Muzio Scevola. So you'll see that it's pretty similar, hopefully. And I have to apologize at this point as well, because yeah, so this is taken from the autograph, which is damaged, was water damaged basically. So throughout the entire score, the top is a bit illegible, but hopefully you'll be able to make enough of it out to get the point. So it's obviously not exact, but they're very clearly closely related there, aren't they? However, Handel changed his mind and he substituted a different aria before the first performance. It may be that this 12/8 version seemed a bit too pastoral, but perhaps also the A section of each text has got quite a different emphasis. So in Muzio, Fidelma's talking about the tediousness of waiting in hope, whilst in Apollo e Daphne, the focus is on freedom in love. The aria that did make its way into the final version is again a borrowing, but this time from Sotto il Lauro in Agrippina. But here there's a much more extensive reworking. So as you can see, that's the Muzio Scevola text at the top, and then the Agrippina text below. So here there is a structural difference between the two texts, namely that the Agrippina aria has got 3 lines in each semistrophe, so a kind of copy and paste approach simply wouldn't work. But similarly, the two texts differ in their meaning, and whilst there's a clear thematic link between the material, the result is a complete reworking, one that, as Winton and Dean remark, beautifully reflects the skittish nature of Fidelma's complaint. And I'm afraid that I don't have a recording of this to play to you. But you can see here, yeah, this is why we need the edition, isn't it? You can see that there is a clear link between that opening material. You know, it's clearly related, isn't it? Even though it is substantially reworked, much more substantially than in Handel's first idea. Now, the first two acts of Muzio are focused on the male's perspective. They centre around Horatio Muzio's brave acts and military exploits. In the third act, it's the female outlook that comes to the front with Clelia's brave deed, and this goes hand in hand with a focus on love. The running theme throughout the whole libretto is liberty, as the Romans defend their republic, and Raleigh highlights this in his dedication to King George. But in the third act, it's liberty and love that features, and this is something that's afforded to the two main female characters too. Clelia is allowed to be with Muzio rather than marrying Cortena out of duty, and Irene is rescued from her betrothal to the tyrant Tarquinio and allowed to pick her choice of man. Unsurprisingly, she opts for Horatio. Thus, the third act is the most conventional in its subject matter, straying far from the historical narrative to focus on love, but also one in which the female point of view is privileged. And it also provides Handel with a poetic stimulus to write some sublime music. Now, whilst there's no evidence to suggest that Muzio was intended to be judged as a competition, it's only natural that contemporary audiences judged the three acts against one another. Their comments must necessarily be read with an awareness of their bias. The highly partisan Elizabeth Lee, for example, wrote that the first act was composed by Signor Bononcini, so she's got it wrong, and the second act by Signor Pippo. Both very bad music, but this third act is so very fine that the music speaks its own praise. And again, she wrote, the first act of this opera was composed by Pippo, the second act by ... which was both excessive bad music. But this third act was composed by Mr. Handel and is incomparable fine, as all his works are. Friedrich Ernst von Fabrice, a director of the Royal Academy who commissioned the work, wrote to Count von Fleming that Handel easily triumphed over the others. And Fleming replied that I'm also very pleased that the German triumphed in composition over all the other musicians. More than a year later, in 17th of July 1722, Richard Mears advertised his The Most Favourite Songs in the Opera of Muzio Scevola, composed by three famous masters, swiftly followed the next month by Walsh's print. Both are identical in content. Bononcini's got 1 overture and 4 arias, Handel's got 3, and Amadei 1. Lowell Lindgren cautions against placing too much weight on Walsh's selection, noticing that it was undoubtedly influenced by whatever music was available to him. But he goes on to say, though, nevertheless, it may be noted that at least during the Academy's 1720 to 22 seasons, Bononcini's songs might have been favoured over those of Handel. Now, if there might be said to be some uncertainty over who was the winner, there's no doubt who the loser was. Whilst a fine cellist, Amadei's compositions were not so well received, and are finished with a famous satire of 1724. As he walked off, who stepped into his place but Signor Pippo with his 4-stringed bass? How far his merit reached the God did know, and bowed to him and bass prodigious low, vowing to him alone the bays he'd grant, could the orchestra but his presence want, since that was time and reputation losing, keep to your playing and leave off composing. There we are. Thank you very much. Grazie.
Grazie a Kerry, grazie per questa interessante e anche divertente, insomma, parte finale, insomma, della sua relazione. Insomma, ancora una volta siamo entrati nel mondo appunto nel quale appunto Handel lavorava e trasformava, insomma, le sue musiche, insomma, riadattandole a nuove occasioni. Grazie. Qualcuno vuol porgere domande a Kerry? C'è tempo perché insomma siamo abbastanza in anticipo, abbiamo oggi mantenuto gli orari, insomma, quindi abbiamo modo di poter discutere.
I'd like to ask if you feel that it was set up to be a competition that Handel would win, or as you've just suggested, that Bononcini was maybe the favorite, but I'm just thinking about this comparison of the third act as being the site where a virtuoso singer would be featured from Professor Over's talk. But here, a virtuoso composer is featured, and there's that additional interesting thing which Handel is entrusted with the sympathetic portrayal of the women characters. I'm sorry, I've completely lost a question there. But I'm one to go back to the first point. Do you feel that the third act was given to Handel in order for him to kind of win this contest?
Thanks. It's a really interesting question, isn't it? It's really hard, I think, for us to kind of looking back, you know, because it's Handel, isn't it? You know, big name Handel kind of a thing. All the evidence seems to be that it wasn't intended as a competition. I mean,
wasn't.
No, I mean, obviously people did respond to it in that way.
I must admit that when this was performed in Holywell Music Room, Oxford, about 100 years ago, but maybe 40, it was assumed by all of us performers that, oh, Handel was best and that was last, you know. And there was, of course, very little interest in Bononcini at that time. So the singers and players looked at it, you know, brushed over it. And I suppose this is a very modern perspective, but one that we could get over now.
Yeah, I mean, it is really hard, isn't it? I know you know this work far better than I do, Rosalind. Yeah.
As I say, it was about 100 years ago.
Yeah, I
mean,
mean,
go unfair.
But no, I think those contemporary reactions are really interesting. I mean, they're clearly, you know, there's so much bias going on there, isn't there? You know, you have to kind of read them very carefully. But I think those contemporary reactions are interesting. And I don't know, was it just literally, did they just throw lots? Do you know, okay, you can have the third act, you can have the second, do you know what I mean? Or, you know, was this part of a, you know, I don't know, is the answer. It does to us looking back, it does seem to be a sort of a bit of a...
I suppose the Handel, because his style is so much more familiar and accepted to us as performers and listeners, that fits into an area of appreciation. Whereas, you know, Bononcini, one can say, despite his wonderful tunes, is still so little performed, I suppose, now, that we lack the feeling of how popular those tunes were when in the 18th century.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that kind of Walsh print thing is interesting, even though, you know, you've got to allow that maybe
that is
not necessarily a judgment, maybe it's just what you've got to hand, but it is interesting that, and I think this is a bit of a turning point, I think, actually, with, you know, and then Handel obviously goes on to great things, doesn't he? But yeah, thanks, Rosie.
It'd be good to have an edition.
Yeah.
So can be performed.
It's just moment, it's just gargantuan. Yeah, but yeah.
Credo sia molto interessante questo dialogo Inghilterra-Australia con Reggio Calabria e la Sicilia in mezzo. Bellissima questa cosa. Quindi, cioè, la musica di Handel non solo veniva ispirata, insomma, dall'essenza femminile, ma insomma le nostre studiose, insomma, hanno molto da dire in questo senso, le ringraziamo. Qualche altro intervento? Professor Over, prego.
Yes, I have a question. So, thank you very much, Carrie, for your interesting paper. I enjoyed it a lot. I wanted to know if you found similar strategies like in the pasticcios, where in the last act of Handel's pasticcios, you find a lot of virtuoso areas, and singers have a prominent role because they only sing virtuoso areas or have a virtuoso area at the end. Did you find a similar strategy in Muzio Scevola?
Good question. It's one I'd have to think about, actually. Yeah. Yeah, let me think about that.
Yeah.
And see what I can come up with. Yeah, but I think it is a really interesting point. Yeah, and I think it depends on the singers as well. You know, there's the whole thing about Anastasia Robinson and, you know, sort of whether how good she was, basically, whether, you know, having an easy but nice song that's a bit sad suits her better, and, you know, that writing specifically for singers, isn't it? Yeah. I'll have a think and let you know. Thank you.
Grazie. Altra domanda?
I was very struck by the age difference of the three composers. Pippo, I mean, he goes way back to the second half of the previous century in Rome. He appears in the Avvisi di Roma, places like that. Does he have any particular parts that he plays on the cello in there, or he's only a composer?
Well, but he did play cello in it. Yeah, I think I was really, because I thought, oh, fantastic, this is going to be brilliant. He's going to have, his act is going to be full of like really interesting cello stuff, and I'm going to look through and find all this. But actually, it wasn't. I kind of thought, oh, there's going to be amazing cello solos, but yeah.
He was, well, I've seen his name quite earlier. I mean, 40 years earlier, he was very famous in Rome.
Yeah.
And some of these cardinals, and then Bononcini has a big hit in 1696. I mean, Rosalind knows all about that, Camilla, but we're talking about 30 years later, and things have really changed. And Handel, of course, is a superior composer.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right. I think that's one of the reasons possibly why Amadei comes off quite so badly, is because when you compare the arias, you know, he has an older approach to structuring arias, for example, that is just largely about repeating things. They tend not to be so long and developed. It tends to be, here's a phrase, let's repeat it, let's, you know, whereas in a kind of an older style that's more typical of kind of turn of the century, you know, when da capo arias are just starting to develop, you know, all that sort of thing. And then you compare that to Handel, and Handel's is much more sophisticated. And actually, I think that's probably one of the reasons why he comes off so badly, really, because you're not really comparing like with like in that sense, I think. Possibly.
Ok, grazie. Ancora qualche altro intervento? Ok, grazie. Grazie ai relatori di oggi, ci hanno veramente arricchito, insomma, lietato con le loro relazioni. A quanto pare per la sessione di stamattina, insomma, è conclusa. Diamo appuntamento, Gaetano, a oggi pomeriggio.
Allora, rimanendo nel tema scherzoso, sperando di non aver fatto troppi pasticci a livello tecnico, diamo appuntamento agli interessati alla sessione che inizierà alle 14:30. Sessione che manterrà lo stesso indirizzo, per cui appunto io non mi scollego, fatelo voi, per cui appunto poi ritornerete, se ne avete voglia, alle 14:30 per rivederci. Buon pranzo, peccato non pagato dal conservatorio, però insomma pasticci ne possiamo comunque fare. Arrivederci allora.
I pasticci non hanno mai fine, insomma, con quello che succede, che può succedere presso il Conservatorio di Reggio, anche a distanza. Grazie e a dopo. Ciao a tutti,
bye.
Buon pranzo. Ciao Rosalind, arrivederci.
Grazie.
Grazie a te, Rosalind.
Thank you, everybody. Bye bye.
Ciao. Gaetano,
dimmi.
puoi aspettare un attimo che riprovo in pratica a riconnettermi per vedere che cosa è successo alla mia videocamera?
D'accordo.
Ok, io sto uscendo e quindi rientrando nuovamente.
Va bene.
Thomas, grazie, arrivederci, a presto. Grazie mille, ora colgo l'occasione per poterti ringraziare personalmente, insomma farlo appunto di persona per la traduzione insomma del mio lavoro sui madrigali di Alessandro Scarlatti. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Ok, mi scollego e poi mi ricollego nuovamente.
Professore?
Prego, Giovanna.
Ecco, prima di scollegarsi, siccome la mia velocità, ricordo qualcosa in inglese, però non sono così veloce, mi date un consiglio su un traduttore simultaneo, qualcosa? Ho visto il canale del professore Piterresi, forse YouTube, ma non sto riuscendo a mettere i sottotitoli. Se magari in qualche modo mi potete dare un'informazione se esiste qualcosa che traduca simultaneamente, perché ho delle difficoltà, confesso.